Listen carefully because what I'm about to tell you is not in the history books. You were never supposed to hear this. On the night of January 14th, 1882, the most powerful woman in Milbrook, Pennsylvania, died in her locked study. They told the public it was heart failure. They told the newspapers it was an unfortunate tragedy. But the truth was darker than any man dared whisper aloud. Her name was Martha Copperfield, the 34-year-old wife of Mayor Theodore Copperfield. And when they found her body, her eyes were wide open, frozen in a terror that no natural death could ever produce. In her stiff, ink-stained fingers, she clutched a leather-bound journal, 17 pages of names, dates, and financial records. 17 pages that exposed a hidden order within the town, a conspiracy threading through church altars, courthouse halls, and the very mills that fed Milbrook's wealth. The journal was seized before her corpse was even carried out of the room. Officially, it vanished. Unofficially, it became the most dangerous document ever written in that valley. This is not just a murder story. It is a descent into the machinery of control, the way power bends truth, the way institutions bury the inconvenient, and the way a single woman with a mind sharper than her husband's ambition became a threat to everything built on corruption. The people of Milbrook were told to grieve, to move on, to remember Martha as a kind hostess and dutiful wife. But 3 witnesses swore they had seen the contents of that journal before it disappeared. They swore it contained records of secret meetings, unexplained deaths, and coded evidence of financial manipulation that could have destroyed half the town's elite. And that's why you're here. Because once you hear this, you can't unhear it. The past doesn't die. It waits, buried under the surface, until someone digs it up and breathes on the embers. Tonight, we dig. Tonight, you'll walk with me into the coal-dusted streets of Milbrook, into the rooms where whispers were more dangerous than knives, into the locked study where Martha Copperfield took her final breath. What you'll discover is not just the truth about her death, it's the truth about power itself. So let me ask you, are you ready to know what Martha knew? The autumn of 1881 arrived like a false blessing, warm winds across western Pennsylvania, the promise of harvests, the laughter of children chasing each other through coal-dusted streets. But beneath that brightness, something rancid stirred. Men spoke in hushed tones of disputes at the textile mill. Strange accidents whispered across the tavern tables, unreported in the newspapers but known in the shadows. And then, on October 15th, the first body broke the illusion of order. His name was Heinrich Zimmermann, a foreman at the mill. He was a man of precision, a man whose steady hands built trust between labor and management alike. He did not drink, did not gamble, did not fight. Yet they found him the next morning at the bottom of Raven's Gorge, his bones shattered, his body twisted against the rocks as if dropped from the sky. The sheriff, William Callahan, a loyal ally of Mayor Copperfield, called it a tragic accident. A shortcut taken at night, a misstep, case closed in 48 hours. But men who knew Zimmermann whispered that something was wrong. His boots bore no mud, no scrape, no sign he had walked the treacherous path. His lunch pail was unopened, the bread and apple inside untouched, as if time itself had stopped for him. Martha was there in the mill office when the news arrived. She saw the worry in the men's eyes, saw the supervisors exchange glances, too careful, too deliberate. And when she looked at the time card Zimmermann had signed the night before, her blood chilled. The signature was shaky, foreign to the steady German hand she had seen dozens of times. It looked like a man under duress, or perhaps a man signing for the last time, knowing death waited for him outside the gates. That night, at dinner, Martha mentioned Zimmermann's death to her husband. The fork in Theodore Copperfield's hand froze midair. His questions came too quickly, too exact: who found the body, how far down the gorge, what the sheriff planned to say. It was not grief that showed in his eyes, nor concern, but calculation. And when Martha suggested aloud that perhaps Zimmermann had been meeting someone, Theodore's voice cut sharp as a blade. Martha, it was an accident. Do not speculate. But she knew her husband. She knew the rhythms of his ambition, the tones of his lies. And she recognized in that instant that something far larger than an accident had taken place in Milbrook. That night, She opened a fresh journal, a leather-bound book waiting on her shelf, and wrote down everything. The time, the details, the expressions. The first entry in what would become a catalogue of forbidden truth. The first step into the labyrinth that would take her life. By late October, Milbrook looked as it always had: church bells ringing on Sundays, smoke curling from the textile mill, the river cutting a black ribbon through the valley. To outsiders, it was a model of American progress. Railroads expanding, industries humming, new immigrants swelling the workforce. But Martha Copperfield's eyes saw further. She noticed the subtle fractures, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the handshakes that lingered too long, the whispers that cut short when she entered the room. The old Protestant families, descendants of the town's first settlers, sat at the top of Milbrook's ladder. They controlled the banks, the mills, the church boards. Their names adorned street signs and business fronts. And beneath them, in the choking smoke and the coal dust, labored the newcomers, the Germans, the Irish, the Catholics. They worked 12-hour shifts, their children tending spindles in the mills, their wives taking in laundry and boarders to survive. Prosperity for the few was purchased with exhaustion for the many. Martha had been raised among privilege, schooled in Philadelphia, married into power. But unlike her husband, she paid attention. At charity events she hosted for the workers' families, she listened. She remembered names, complaints, accidents that were quickly declared resolved. She noticed how often men vanished from the mills, sometimes quietly dismissed, sometimes dead from inexplicable mishaps in the mines, sometimes simply gone, their families left with silence and unpaid wages. The atmosphere in Milbrook grew charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. The Germans, led quietly by men like Zimmerman, had begun murmuring about forming a labor association. The Irish, hardened by famine and poverty, whispered their own prayers in crowded boarding houses, watching the town's officials with suspicious eyes. And the town's Protestant elite, men like Theodore Copperfield, played their public role of benevolence while, behind closed doors, scheming to keep order at any cost. Martha sensed the truth before she could name it. Milbrook was not just a town. It was an engine, grinding men into profit, maintained by a silent agreement among those who benefited from the machine. And anyone who threatened to jam its gears, whether by union, complaint, or inconvenient honesty, was dealt with swiftly. Zimmerman's broken body at Raven's Gorge was not an accident. It was a message. She began to record it, all the names of men who disappeared, the connections between church elders and business owners, the sheriff's quick dismissals. First, it was curiosity. But the more she wrote, the more she realized she was sketching the outline of something immense and dangerous. A conspiracy not of shadows, but of familiar faces, neighbors, colleagues, men who smiled at her across the town square. Martha Copperfield was beginning to understand that the very air of Milbrook was poisoned with power, and she was breathing it in. It was in November, as the first snows fell across the valley, that Martha began to notice the pattern. At first it seemed trivial. Theodore excusing himself late at night, the carriage lanterns flickering down Elm Street, footsteps on the porch long after midnight. She asked no questions. Her husband's ambition had always demanded late meetings and urgent conversations, but now, sharpened by Zimmerman's death, her mind catalogued every detail. The same names circled again and again: Judge Alistair Wainwright, Reverend Samuel Harlan, mill supervisor James Crawford, and, most disturbingly, Sheriff Callahan. Men from different spheres: law, faith, labor, and order, yet all tied together by Theodore's expanding influence. Martha began to notice that when these men gathered, accidents followed. A worker crushed beneath a collapsed beam in the mill. A Catholic priest found drowned in the river, his death ruled as evening intoxication. Each tragedy came after hushed gatherings in parlors, after her husband's clothes carried the scent of cigars and brandy. From her study window, Martha watched shadows moving through the square, slipping into the back entrance of Wainwright's law office. She saw men arrive separately, never together, careful to disguise the rhythm of conspiracy. But she had grown too skilled at reading faces, at sensing the strain of secrets. At the Copperfield home itself, she observed the shift in Theodore's tone. His temper shortened. His silences lengthened, his eyes sharper when she pressed him with harmless questions. It was at one of her own social events, a Christmas planning committee, that she saw the truth laid bare. Reverend Harlan, his hand resting too casually on Sheriff Callahan's arm, whispering in his ear as Theodore stood close by, nodding with that false smile of agreement. Their conversation ended the moment they saw Martha approach, but not before she caught the word ledger on Harlan's lips. A single word, but enough to ignite suspicion. That night, in her journal, she wrote, "Theodore is not merely attending meetings. He is part of something woven. The names repeat, the faces gather, the pattern is unmistakable. These are not accidents. These are arrangements." The realization was both clarifying and suffocating. Her husband was no longer simply the mayor of Milbrook. He was a node in a web stretching across pulpit, bench, uniform, and mill office, a network designed not for governance but for control. And if Zimmerman had indeed been silenced for stepping out of line, then Martha knew what she was truly holding in her leather-bound journal, the map of Milbrook's hidden order. And she knew enough already to be dangerous. Martha Copperfield was no fool. She knew that to challenge the men directly would be suicide. Power in Milbrook was spoken in smoke-filled rooms, behind locked doors, under the glow of gaslight. But women, wives, sisters, daughters were left in the drawing rooms, tending the tea, arranging the flowers, knitting while their husbands conspired. That was the men's mistake. They assumed women did not listen. Martha listened. At luncheons and sewing circles, she began to ask the kinds of questions that seemed innocent. "Has your husband been working late as well? Is Reverend Harlan traveling often these days?" Simple curiosities wrapped in smiles. The answers came in nervous laughter, in lowered voices, in small confessions dropped like crumbs. One woman admitted her husband came home smelling of tobacco not his own. Another confessed she had seen Judge Wainwright slip a sealed envelope to the sheriff in the back pew after service. The fragments were small, but Martha knew how to weave them. Patterns emerged. Meetings not tied to civic duty but to nights of sudden absences. Unexpected expenses on ledgers. A whisper of a fund, collected quietly from mill owners and distributed with no accounting. The women did not understand the gravity of what they revealed. They thought they were merely gossiping. But to Martha, every word was another stone in the hidden foundation. She also began to notice the fear, not spoken but shown. A twitch in the eye, a hesitation before answering. One woman, pale as linen, begged Martha not to mention her name if she repeated what she had said. "It is not safe to ask," she whispered. "Not safe even for you." The words echoed in Martha's mind long after the gathering had ended. Her journal grew heavier with each entry. Names, places, snippets of overheard conversations. She drew connecting lines between them like a map. But with each line she drew, her pulse quickened with a deeper understanding. This was not just corruption. This was a system, a machinery of power that ran on fear, loyalty, and silence. And yet, in her own way, Martha had begun to breach that silence. She had opened the first cracks in a wall meant to keep the town blind. She knew now that the women of Milbrook, overlooked and underestimated, carried within them the evidence of their husbands' secrets. And if those fragments were woven together, they could unravel the entire fabric. What Martha did not yet understand was that the men were already watching her. And once they realized she was gathering threads, she would no longer be an observer of the conspiracy, she would become its target. The first warnings were almost elegant, too clever to be crude, and therefore more terrifying. A single white glove left on the Copperfield doorstep after midnight. A carriage wheel deliberately loosened so that Theodore's friend stumbled on his return from a late meeting. A servant who had always answered Martha politely now avoided her gaze and muttered that people were asking questions. These were not random cruelties. They were the language of control, written in small, precise acts meant to unnerve. They spoke to her more loudly than any shouted threat. They said, "Without words, we can touch you anywhere." Martha felt a change in the air, a tightening like a hand at the back of her neck. She began to notice the pattern of footsteps outside her study, slow, deliberate, pausing beneath the window. Once, returning from a river walk, she found fresh footprints pressing into the snow around her garden bench, as if someone had sat there waiting for her to return. No one admitted to the intrusion. No one apologized. The town closed its eyes with the practiced indifference of those who profit from silence. Then the notes began. Not letters those could be traced, but slips of paper, folded small, slipped beneath the door or pinned to her dress on the hem, as if sewn there by an invisible hand. One said simply, "Curiosity kills more than cats." Another, more precise, read, "Keep your pen to household accounts." The voice behind the paper was calm. The voice understood her habit of recording, and it aimed straight for the thing that made her dangerous. Her memory, her diligence, her willingness to translate whisper into written proof. Martha tested the edges of the threat by speaking plainly to friends. At first, they denied seeing anything. Then, in the privacy of a dark kitchen, a woman she trusted confessed that Sheriff Callahan had visited her husband and told him to mind his tongue. The woman's hands trembled as she placed a kettle on the stove and begged Martha not to pursue the matter. "If you value your husband, your home," she said, "drop it." The plea was not for herself alone. It carried the weight of entire families whose livelihoods depended on the Copperfields' cooperation. Fear had become currency in Milbrook. Every subtle intimidation tightened the cage. Martha found threads of surveillance in the most intimate places. A mill hand's sudden absence when she sought a conversation. A clergyman who closed his book mid-sentence whenever she entered the pew. A neighbor who crossed the street to avoid greeting her. It was as if someone had quietly announced a list of consequences and then watched to see who would obey. She understood then that knowledge was not merely dangerous to the powerful. It was dangerous to the knower. The act of knowing made her a living threat. And once a person becomes a threat, the machinery of removal begins soft at first, precise, almost polite, until it finishes with a silence that can never be unmade. Martha's pen trembled in her hand as she wrote, "They see me. They are closing in." By December, the walls of Milbrook no longer felt like home, they felt like a stage, and Martha understood she was being watched as an unwilling actress in someone else's script. Every time she opened her study window, she half expected to see a figure standing motionless in the square below, waiting. Every letter she received, even those from her own family in Philadelphia, carried the faint suspicion of tampering. The silence of the town had thickened into something oppressive, a silence that seemed to breathe against her ear, daring her to break it. And yet, the very weight of this pressure sharpened her resolve. Fear became fuel. She began to write in her journal not just the names and dates, but her interpretations, the motives, the alignments, the possible outcomes if the hidden structure of Milbrook were dragged into light. She realized with chilling clarity that what she was seeing was not simply a cluster of men protecting their wealth. It was a system of psychological control. Fear wasn't just an accident of circumstance. It was the chosen instrument. They ruled not by law or faith, but by invisible pressure, the kind that forced people to police their own thoughts. Martha understood something few ever grasp. Control is more powerful when it is invisible. It is not the lock on the door that imprisons you, it is the suggestion that someone is listening on the other side. It is not the noose around your neck, but the whisper that someone you love will wear it if you speak. Milbrook was not merely corrupt. It was engineered, designed to create obedience without question. One evening, at a holiday gathering, she tested the truth aloud. Surrounded by women sipping cider, she spoke the word, ledger. The effect was instantaneous. A hush fell over the group. One woman choked on her drink. Another stared at the floor as if she hadn't heard. Within moments, polite conversation returned, louder than before, forced and bright. But Martha had seen the fear ripple through them. That one word held the weight of unspoken knowledge. They all knew. They all carried pieces of the secret, and they had all been trained, without instruction, to never ever speak of it. That night, Martha wrote with ink so heavy it tore the page. Milbrook is not a town. It is a theater of control. Every man an actor. Every woman a keeper of silence. And the script is written by those who meet behind closed doors. She paused before adding one final line. If they rule by silence, then my voice will be my weapon. The decision to act came not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of unbearable weight. Martha's journals were filling faster than ever, page after page of details, names, times, connections. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, light a single candle, and continue writing until dawn, her hand cramping, her eyes burning. She had built a record that, if ever exposed, could fracture the entire architecture of Milbrook's power. And she knew it. The question was not whether she had enough to act. The question was how. At first, she considered sending anonymous letters to the Philadelphia newspapers. A distant city would be beyond the grasp of Milbrook's men. But then came the darker realization. Newspapers survive on funding, and funding flows from the same networks of power she was trying to expose. What if her letters were intercepted? What if her identity was betrayed before the story ever reached the public? Another possibility gnawed at her: the women of Milbrook. She imagined gathering them, one by one, sharing her journal, weaving their fragments together until the silence shattered. But fear had so thoroughly colonized them that she doubted they would stand with her. To pull them in would be to endanger them, and she could not bear the thought of other families destroyed because of her rebellion. Still, Martha tested the edges. She dropped phrases in conversations, asked sharper questions, watched carefully for reactions. At a tea hosted by the judge's wife, she mentioned casually that certain ledgers seemed incomplete. The room went still. Within a week, her maid reported that a man had come to the house asking unusual questions about Martha's study habits. The line had been crossed. They knew she was circling the truth. That night, for the first time, Martha considered something audacious. She would not wait for someone else to deliver her words. She would deliver them herself publicly, unmistakably, in a way that could not be denied or silenced. She envisioned the town square, a gathering, a speech perhaps cloaked in civility but loaded with revelation. If she chose her words carefully, if she revealed just enough, she could light the fuse. But the danger had already shifted. Until now, she had been an observer, a recorder, a woman collecting whispers in the privacy of her study. The moment she resolved to act, she crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer simply dangerous knowledge in human form, she was a weapon preparing to fire. And weapons are always disarmed before they strike. Her final entry that week read, "Truth will not remain hidden, even if it costs me, especially if it costs me." By January of 1882, the air in Milbrook felt sharpened, as though winter itself had grown teeth. The townspeople moved briskly through the snow, collars high, eyes averted. Conversations seemed shorter, as if even casual words carried risk. Martha felt it most in the spaces between her days, the knock that lingered too long at her door, the flicker of a shadow in the street lamp's glow, the faint scuff of boots retreating just as she turned her head. The men who ruled Milbrook had begun to move against her. The first sign came with her mail. A bundle of letters from Philadelphia arrived at her doorstep, the seal on every envelope crudely broken, the contents rearranged. A cousin's note about the illness of an aunt had been resealed with different ink. Another letter, innocuous, merely social, was missing altogether. It was a warning: we know your connections. We can cut them off whenever we choose. Days later, her trusted maid, Anna, returned pale and shaken from the market. A man she described only as smiling too widely had pressed a folded scrap of paper into her hand. Written in an uneven scrawl were 5 words: "The widow should stay silent." Martha burned the paper in the stove, but the smell of its smoke seemed to cling to the walls of her home for hours. And then came the night of the fire. It began as a faint crackle, an acrid scent curling under the doorframe of her study. Martha had been writing when she noticed it. By the time she flung the door open, flames had begun to lick the curtains in the parlor. She shouted for Anna, who rushed with a bucket from the kitchen. Together they smothered the blaze before it spread beyond the room. When it was done, Martha's hands were raw and blistered, her hair singed, the house filled with smoke. The fire marshal, one of the judge's loyal men, called it a faulty lamp, though the lamp in question sat intact and unbroken on the table. It was no accident. It was a message. That night, when the embers cooled and the house was still, Martha sat at her desk and forced her shaking hand to write. They will not kill me outright. Not yet. They will circle closer, tightening the rope, until fear makes me undo myself. But they miscalculate. I do not break by silence, I break only by speaking. And so I must speak, before the rope pulls taut. The shadow war was no longer quiet. The conspiracy had revealed its teeth. And Martha knew her time to act was running out. The fire changed everything. What had once been whispers and shadows was now open aggression. Martha understood the calculus. If they had truly wanted her dead, the flames would have been allowed to spread unchecked. No, the blaze had been meant as theater, a stage-managed reminder of her fragility. Yet rather than frighten her into retreat, it clarified her purpose. Fear had carried her only so far. Now she would answer with defiance. Her first thought was the church. Every Sunday, the whole of Milbrook gathered under its vaulted ceiling, eyes trained on the pulpit, ears accustomed to sermons that mixed scripture with social order. It was there, she thought, that she could lace her voice through theirs, not as an outright accusation but as a seed planted in soil that had been carefully kept barren. But she quickly realized the risk. The church itself was part of the machinery. The minister, though outwardly pious, dined too often at the judge's table. To speak there would be to hand her enemies the stage. So she turned instead to the printed word. By candlelight, she began drafting a series of anonymous broadsides, half essay, half warning. She wrote of ledgers that do not match their sums, of men who profit when children starve, of deaths too easily explained by accident. She sharpened each phrase like a blade veiled enough to avoid direct charge, pointed enough to pierce the surface of Milbrook's silence. Her plan was simple. Once printed, the broadsides could be slipped beneath doors, tacked to fence posts, left in baskets of bread at the market. Truth would travel without her face attached. Yet the danger sharpened with every line she wrote. Anna reported that a figure had been seen loitering outside the printer's shop at odd hours watching, waiting. When Martha attempted to purchase fresh ink, the clerk handed it to her wordlessly, his hands trembling as though even the transaction marked him. And in her own home, small changes unsettled her. A chair moved an inch from where she left it, her journal left slightly askew. She began to suspect that her house itself had been entered while she slept. Still, she pressed on. Her final draft ended with a line that trembled with defiance. A town built on silence will one day collapse beneath the weight of its own lies. She read it aloud in her study, her voice low but steady, and felt something within her shift. For the first time since her husband's death, she was no longer reacting to Milbrook's power, she was wielding her own. But as she gathered her pages, a knock came at the door. Too soft for a visitor. Too late for courtesy. Anna froze. Martha felt her pulse surge. When she opened the door, no one stood on the porch. Only a single object lay on the step. A dead sparrow, its wings neatly pinned with sewing needles, its beak stuffed with ash. The message was clear. They knew she was preparing to speak, and they were already answering. The first snowfall of February cloaked Milbrook in silence, and Martha chose that hush as her cover. With Anna's trembling help, she bundled her broadsides in twine, slipping them into a basket lined with bread loaves. Her plan was simple, almost rustic. Distribute them by hand, cloaked in the ordinary. A leaflet here, beneath a doorframe. Another slipped into a hymnal at the church. Another pressed between bolts of cloth in the dry goods store. By dawn, she told herself, Milbrook would awaken to whispers on paper truths carried where voices dared not tread. For a fleeting moment it worked. She saw the startled faces of townsfolk bending to retrieve the folded sheets, their eyes widening as they read. She watched one farmer tuck the paper hastily into his coat, another woman cross herself before thrusting it deep into her apron pocket. Martha's words had left her study, and in those hours she felt a thrill of victory. The silence had been punctured, but by evening the counterstroke arrived. At the market square, the judge's men moved briskly, gathering the leaflets in armfuls, their boots leaving black streaks on the snow. The minister stood at their side, shaking his head in grave disapproval as if the words themselves were blasphemy. By sunset, an official notice was tacked to every post in town. Malicious pamphlets have been circulated by an enemy of Milbrook. Possession of such lies will be treated as sedition against the moral and economic order of this community. The effect was swift and suffocating. The farmer who had tucked away his leaflet now avoided Martha's gaze entirely. The woman who had crossed herself passed by her home the next morning with eyes fixed straight ahead, lips tight. What had been a seed of rebellion was now recast as poison, and the town recoiled in practiced obedience. That night, Martha found one of her own broadsides nailed to her door, defaced with a single word scrawled in coal, which, the message cut deeper than any official decree, which was the word Milbrook reserved for women who strayed beyond their appointed roles, for voices that rose too loud. It was not just insult, it was the first step toward social erasure, toward sanctioning whatever might come next. Martha sat at her desk, staring at the ruined paper, her hands trembling. She realized with terrible clarity that the men of Milbrook did not need to burn her words to ash. They only needed to brand her a danger, and the town itself would turn against her. The broadsides had not failed, they had been smothered. And now she was not merely a widow with suspicions. She was a marked woman. The word which still clung to Martha's door the next morning. Blackened coal dust flaking onto the threshold like ashes. Neighbors crossed the street rather than pass too near her gate. The grocer refused her coin, muttering that her silver bore a curse. Even the children who once waved from the square now jeered in shrill voices, emboldened by their parents' whispers. Isolation had descended with the weight of iron chains. For 3 days she considered surrender. The journal lay unopened on her desk, its pages heavy with names and numbers that seemed now to burn her fingers when she touched it. She told herself she could stop. She could burn the book, close the study, and feign ignorance. She could play the mayor's grieving widow, retreat into silence, and live out her years as a harmless relic. The thought of peace beckoned like a faint light across a frozen river. But in the stillness, other voices stirred. The foreman Heinrich Zimmermann, his body shattered at the gorge, called from memory. The girl Mary Donnelly, dead at 16, buried quickly without a doctor's eye. The unnamed laborers whose wages vanished into the mayor's ledgers while their children starved. Martha felt them in the walls of her home, restless, accusing, unwilling to be buried with her cowardice. The decision crystallized not in fury, but in a cold, almost serene clarity. Retreat would not save her. They had already marked her. To silence herself now would only confirm her guilt and accelerate her erasure. If she was to fall, she would fall striking. So she began again. No longer content with whispers on paper, she resolved to pierce the veil in a way Milbrook's elites could not so easily smother. The church, their fortress of control, their stage for moral theater, would be her battleground. Sunday sermons bound the town more tightly than any law, and from its pulpit the people absorbed truth unquestioned. If she could disrupt that, even for a moment, she could see doubt not just in scattered households, but in the very heart of Milbrook's order. The risk was staggering. To speak there, to confront them in their sanctum, would be to stand exposed before the entire town. One word out of place, one tremor of fear, and she would not walk home again. Yet as Martha closed the journal that night and pressed it to her chest, she whispered a vow. If they burn me, they will burn with me. In that vow she crossed a threshold. There was no retreat left. The only path forward was into the fire itself. She chose a Sunday when the church was fullest, carved pews heavy with men in work-stiff coats, women with gloved hands folded like iron, children restless on their mothers' laps. Snow had smudged the square into a hush, and the steeple bell had tolled 8 times before she stepped through the heavy oak doors. The air inside smelled of tallow and old wood, the hush of prayer thick as a curtain. Every face turned toward the pulpit expecting scripture and comfort. Instead, they would receive an accusation. Martha walked with a calm that belonged to someone who had already accepted the consequence of truth. Her gloves were removed. Her hands were steady. She took the center aisle not as a supplicant but as a deliberate force, each footstep measured to crack the rhythm of ritual. Murmurs flickered like startled birds. Theodore sat near the front, cheeks flushed, his jaw a hard line. Reverend Harlan's sermon faltered as she passed. His eyes, practiced and benign, snapped to hers with a flash of something not entirely contained. When she reached the rail, she did not speak at first. She let the silence press against them until it felt intolerable. Then, in a voice that carried without begging, she began. She did not shout. She did not plead. She spoke as one who had catalogued the ledger of a town and decided that the final entry must be read aloud. She recited names workers and clerks, widows and small boys, names the town preferred to forget. She described ledger entries that ate wages, meetings held in cigar smoke where decisions were made about who would live and who would vanish, the pattern of accidents that stitched themselves into policy. She named the judge, the sheriff, the mill supervisor. She spoke of Reverend Harlan's trips and Theodore's late-night carriage returns. Each revelation landed like a coin on a hard table, simple, undeniable, heavy with consequence. The reaction was immediate and feral. Men stood as if yanked by strings. Some cursed, some laughed in panic, others bolted for the doors with faces gone pale. Theodore rose, his hand trembling, then wrapped his cloak about him and forced a smile meant to disarm. Reverend Harlan, lips pressed thin, called her a blasphemer and waved the congregation toward order as if the shape of faith could smother proof. Sheriff Callahan moved forward with a deputy at his shoulder, the law poised like a weapon. But something else happened too, a quiet she had not expected. A few hands, small, tentative, reached into pockets and unfolded the broadsides she had distributed. Eyes scanned columns of names already familiar to Martha's journal. A murmur of recognition rippled through the back pews, not loud enough to break the men's control, but present, stubborn as a seed. In that brief window, she saw fear and awakening mix in equal measure. She did not finish in mercy. She read the last lines of her list and folded the paper, placing it on the pulpit as if returning a balance. Then she stepped back into the aisle and let the machinery respond. As doors slammed and footsteps faded into snow, the truth she had spoken settled like a stone thrown into still water. Its ripples would not be contained. They did not arrest her immediately. That would have made her a martyr, a living symbol, a flame too bright to stamp out. Instead, the machine turned slower, quieter, more suffocating. By evening, the church steps were scrubbed clean of her words, the pulpit wiped as if her voice had left a stain. The sheriff declared the outburst a widow's hysteria, a woman unhinged by grief. The judge signed orders forbidding further distribution of slanderous material, and Theodore, with a mask of wounded dignity, announced that his late wife had succumbed to feminine delusion, a condition brought on by stress and solitude. They made her a mad woman in the eyes of her neighbors, dangerous, but pitiable. Yet the town could not unhear her. Behind closed doors, her accusations crawled like insects. Men who once raised their hats now lowered their eyes, afraid that even a glance might tie them to her. At the mill, whispers spread among the workers. If the foreman didn't fall, then who pushed him? At the tavern, one man swore he'd seen the mayor and the reverend in secret conference after midnight. At the boarding house, the immigrant women prayed more fiercely, as if protection from curses might also shield them from truth. Martha herself lived in a silence sharper than chains. Grocers refused her. Letters ceased to arrive. Neighbors pretended not to see her lamp glow at night. Even Anna, faithful Anna, warned in tears that her position as maid endangered her family, and within a week she too was gone. The house on Elm Street, once a center of charity and gatherings, became a fortress of exile. But isolation did not extinguish her resolve. If anything, it deepened it. In the hollow spaces of her home, she wrote faster, darker, filling her journal with dates, confessions, and cross-referenced betrayals. Her handwriting grew jagged, her ink stains permanent. She no longer trusted her words to survive only on paper. She began making copies, binding them in oilcloth, and hiding them in places she prayed the elites could not reach: beneath floorboards, inside hollow beams, under the roots of the riverbank willows. She knew the net was tightening, that her survival was measured in days, not months. And still she planned her final act. If they would not allow her voice in the church, then she would plant it deeper, inescapable. She envisioned the town confronted not with whispers, but with an unanswerable revelation, one so visible, so undeniable, that even the most obedient citizen could not look away. But in Milbrook, the machine was always listening. And before she could strike again, it struck first. Came not as a mob, not as fire, not as rope. It came the way power always comes when it wishes to erase without spectacle, silent, practiced, absolute. On the night of January 22nd, 1882, snow pressed hard against the windows of the house on Elm Street. Martha sat at her desk, the leather journal open, ink still wet on the final entry. She had written a single line across the page. If I vanish, the truth does not. She did not hear the latch lift. She did not hear the floorboards creak. What she felt was presence, a shadow folding into the room, cold as the steel clasping her shoulder. The coroner's record would later say heart failure. But the neighbor who glanced through her window swore she saw Martha's eyes, wide and wild, as though frozen on something unspeakable. The ink had smeared across her fingertips, dragged by a hand that had been writing until the final instant. By dawn it was over. Sheriff Callahan barred the house. The judge signed a swift order. Reverend Harlan delivered a sermon of female frailty and the dangers of untempered imagination. And Theodore, solemn-faced, stood before the congregation and told them his beloved wife had died of grief, of exhaustion, of her own mind. In hours, the narrative was sealed. Martha Copperfield was no martyr, no prophet, only a cautionary tale. Yet the machine had not calculated for what she left behind. The journal was seized, locked away in the courthouse archives, catalogued as household accounts. But her hiding places, the oilcloth bundles beneath floorboards, under riverbank roots, wedged into hollow beams, remained. Fragments survived, waiting, smuggled into hands that read by candlelight and whispered of the woman who dared to name names. Children grew into men, remembering their mothers' hushed warnings. Laborers passed rumors like contraband. The name Martha Copperfield became less of a tragedy and more of a legend, sharpened with every retelling. And now, more than a century later, we are left with the question her killers could never extinguish. What truth was so dangerous that the wife of a mayor had to be silenced, erased, branded as mad, and buried beneath official lies? You can dismiss it as myth if you choose. You can tell yourself the heart stops when it chooses. But remember, this power never kills without reason. And when it does, it leaves ghosts that refuse to be quiet. So ask yourself, what legacy have you inherited from the shadows of your own town? What truths lie buried beneath polite records and official verdicts? Because the story of Martha Copperfield is not finished. It is only waiting for the man who dares to dig. You've heard the story they buried. You've walked with me through the corridors of power, through whispers, ledgers, and blood. Martha Copperfield is not just a woman lost to 1882, she is the mirror they hope you never look into. Because every town, every institution, every nation has its Copperfields. And the same hands that silenced her are still at work, tightening the noose around every truth that threatens them. But you are not like the others. You wouldn't still be here if you were. You've felt that chill in your bones, that recognition that something in this tale is not confined to the past. It is alive. It breathes in the walls of your own life. So now it is your turn to decide. Will you close the book and walk away? Or will you mark yourself as one who sees? If you choose the latter, write this phrase in the comments twice. The truth does not vanish. Not once, twice. Seal it. Mark yourself. Show me and show the algorithm that you belong to the small brotherhood who do not bow, who do not sleep. And if you hunger for more, if you are ready to keep pulling at the hidden threads that stitch our history together in blood and deception, then subscribe now. Ring the bell. Because this is not entertainment. This is initiation. And every story we tell here is another brick torn out of their walls. They silenced Martha Copperfield. But they did not silence us. Not yet.